Good morning, everybody, and welcome to day 3 of our Soil and Water Management Week about dealing with dry soil conditions. Today is what we have dubbed Weed Wednesday. And so we are going to be focusing today on weed management, specifically things, I guess Kim's going to be talking today about things like how do we make decisions around tillage for weed management this fall. What is the best way to kind of plan or prep or deal with things like herbicide carryover, stuff like that, that these dry conditions are going to be causing a little bit of an issue when we are dealing with weed control. A reminder that for all of you who are CCAs, for your CEUs, your CCA credits, I will be entering that information afterwards. So when you registered, you will have put your CCA number in. If for some reason you did not put your CCA number in or weren't asked to put your CCA number in when you registered, please send me an email. I will put my email in the chat box so that you can see it. And so that will give me your CCA number so that we can submit that after the fact. Again, anyone who is watching this as a recording right now on the YouTube page, you can submit your CCA credits as a self-report. All right, so Kim Brown-Livingston is here today to take it away, leading our discussion on weed management in these dry conditions. And unfortunately, Kim's webcam isn't working, so we won't be able to see her lovely face on screen, but we'll still be able to hear her. So take it away, Kim.
Okay, thanks very much, Marla, and thanks everybody for attending. Unfortunately, you're not going to be getting any soil and water credits from me today. I think we've got these credits down as crop management, but the soil herbicide, residue herbicide stuff fits in with this week's theme. So unfortunately, you can get your soil and water credits from all the other presentations as well. But because I know being a CCA, those are hard to get, and those are really nice to get some good information and get those credits at the same time. So I wanted to talk about soil residual chemistries and kind of go through some of the basics on it. There's really not a lot we can do about it, but to understand how some of these things work and what maybe some challenges we're facing. So we've called this Weed Wednesday, and we'll go forward. So herbicide residues in dry years. Now we like our residual herbicides. There's lots of advantages to using them. They've been around for 40 years or more. We look back to some of the old yellow ones, like the group 3s that have been around for a very long time before what some of you young farmers, I've heard you referred to as the Roundup babies. You don't remember what herbicide use was like before we had Roundup or before we had glyphosate. And we did have to use a lot of these older chemistries, and a lot of them with residual. So the advantages, we get our flushing weeds, we can get our late emergent weeds, and we're actually starting to go back to some of the older chemistry and as well some of the newer chemistries that we're dealing with. They're pre-herbicides, and they're not a pre-burn in that they don't necessarily do burn off the weeds that are there, but they have activity on the weeds as they emerge. So we need to make sure when we're talking about our pre-herbicides, that's what I'm talking about in this talk today, not so much that pre-seed burn off, but I am talking about the herbicides that do have a soil residual, and they affect the weeds as they emerge. And so we're really seeing these necessary a part of our weed control package because of the resistance of weeds to in-crop herbicides. And I'm thinking if even you look south of the border with their water hemp and palmer amaranth issues, they're really having to go after a lot of those weeds with some pre-herbicides, and we call that herbicide layering or herbicide stacking. And we're starting with our pre-herbicides with our residual. We're still doing a pre-burn, and we're coming back with whatever in-crop herbicides we have. When we look to our counterparts in Ontario, they're doing the same thing with the weed that they have there, Canada fleabane. We have that one here, and it really hasn't become much of an issue, but they are starting to have to deal with that because of its in-crop. Because of its resistance issues and because of the in-crop herbicides not working. So we need these residual herbicides. We have to have them, or we're not going to be able to grow some of our crops anymore. We're not going to be able to get the weeds out. So they're in some cases a necessary evil. I don't know if that's the right way to put it, but there's with the good we have to take the bad. And so when we're counting on that residue going after the weeds we want, there's also the possibility that that residue can stick around too long, and that's the downside of them. So when we talk about persistence versus bioavailability, some herbicides are very persistent in soil, but that doesn't mean they're bioavailable. And some of our herbicides, again, they can get bound very quickly. Even something like glyphosate, it's bound very quickly in the soil, but it's not available at all and doesn't cause any issues with any subsequent crops. And degradation of any herbicide is complex, but basically the major pathways would be volatilization, photolysis, which is breakdown by sunlight, leaching with water, chemical hydrolysis, and microbial breakdown. And soil, water, and temperature are crucial for microbial breakdown. So breakdown requires sufficient time under adequate moisture and soil temperature to support the growth of microbes that degrade herbicide molecules. So that's basically how most of our herbicide breakdown takes place. Some herbicides will break down very, very quickly, or they're tightly bound. Like I said before, persistence is different than bioavailability. So then they're not a problem for subsequent crops. And others will take longer to decay, which means they can persist into the next season or seasons, depending on the herbicide and depending on the crop and that they're sensitive to, or the crop that is sensitive to that residue. And of course, it can injure sensitive crops, and this depends on which herbicide we're talking about and which crops we're trying to grow. So our in-season moisture after herbicide application is our most important factor for herbicide breakdown, for the herbicides that we're dealing with here in Western Canada. Oops. Frozen for some reason. Hang on. Sorry, my computer screen is frozen. Okay, well, I can see my next slide. I guess you guys can't, but I'm not really sure what's happened to my screen right now. In general, general rules for breakdown would be that many herbicides are broken down by microbial composition, which we just talked about. In addition, some of the sulphonylurea, some of those group 2s, and the triazines, which is our group 5, which is like for us atrazine in Western Canada, and there's others elsewhere, but here it's atrazine. They're broken down by chemical reactions like acid hydrolysis. Herbicide molecules must be free from binding to soil particles or organic matter for the soil microorganisms to degrade them. So in order for them, if they're bound really tightly, they don't degrade. But the problem is then that they can, if they're, the problem with some of the herbicides is that they adsorb very, very tightly, and then with wetting cycles, they can desorb as well and then become available. And again, most herbicide molecules are more tightly bound in dry soils than in moist soils. So again, that can be a problem because our persistence will be longer. And chemical degradation, is affected by soil pH, and acid hydrolysis nearly ceases above pH of 6.8. So in our Western Canadian soils, a lot of our soils are very high pH or higher than 6.8. So the molecules that break down with acid hydrolysis, it's usually quite slow at those pH. And I'm not sure what to do.
Escape out of your presentation mode and then try resetting your presentation mode.
I'll just end my slideshow maybe and start again.
Yeah, see if that does it.
Sorry. Okay, we'll try again. In the beginning. And I'll switch them. Okay, get my pointer. Sorry about that, guys. There we go.
When in doubt,
okay, restart. We just restart, yeah. Works for lots of things in life, just a reboot. Okay, so yeah, we just ran over this slide. I didn't show it, but I could see it up next, so I read it off to you. So again, the last thing I said was acid hydrolysis. It nearly ceases above 6.8. So again, soil microorganisms are crucial. And again, so the moisture that we've not had this year, moisture and temperature is what's crucial for a microbial breakdown. And we've definitely had the temperatures. In fact, we've still got great temperatures now, but we have not had that moisture. So that's really going to be affecting our our herbicide breakdown. So then what I've done is I've gone through some of the groups and or gone through some of the groups that we're going to be having issues with, and I'm just going to talk about kind of the background and how these things break down and what we can look forward to. The group twos, there's different types of group twos, but the IMIs and the TPSs, we're not as concerned about those TPSs. That's more the IMIs here in Western Canada. We don't have a lot of TPS herbicides in the group twos that we're concerned about. And but they are broken down by microbes. So any factors that increase microbial activity, which is basically your warm, moist conditions, that will increase degradation. So they're weakly bound to soil, but they're strongly bound to organic matter. So, and pH less than 6.5 for the IMIs, and basically between 6.5 and 8, there's almost no change in how much is bound. But below 6.5, the adsorption greatly increases. In fact, it doubles, I think, for every 0.2% change in soil pH. So we really see an issue with the IMIs on acid soils, which luckily in Manitoba we don't have a lot of. But having said that, there are places in our fields that do have, you know, more acid pHs. But again, we hear a lot, and if we look to our neighbors in the west in Alberta, where they have that region of acid soils, they do have more of an issue with IMI carryover there. And for the TPS herbicides, again, we're not as concerned, but they do act very similarly to the IMIs, so I thought I'd mention them here. pH basically is less than 7 for that. They are adsorbed onto the soil organic matter, and again, to some extent, soil. They're adsorbed more strongly as the soil dries, but they can desorb and go into soil solution with moisture, and this is what causes crop injuries. So that adsorption, desorption, you know, when they're tightly bound and they're not being broken down, they're not available to the crop, they're not hurting the next crop, but when they become available, when we do get moisture, which we need to have in order to grow our next crop, if you've been following along this week, you found that we're basically a full season behind in moisture, and so we're going to have a lot of moisture to catch us up, and that is going to cause some of these chemistries to become more available. So degradation increases above the pH 6.5 for the IMIs or 7 for the TPSs. As they're not absorbed, they're in soil solution, they're available for plant uptake and for microbial breakdown. So again, we tend not to see these in a regular year where we've got lots of moisture. However, most of you have seen this come out from BASF, and this is their document that talks about urgent notice to growers. And it says the 2021 growing season has been tough across Western Canada. There is a high degree, I'm just kind of reading the highlights here, and you can see where it's bolded. There's a high degree of risk of injury for sensitive crops such as canola, durum wheat, and canary seed. And they talk about certain environmental conditions can delay the breakdown in soils, but this year is different. So in addition to what is currently on the rotational crop labels, they have actually, BASF has actually added some additional restrictions on to our for crop rotation restrictions. And now I've just given you the top part of the document here because the brown soils is even more restrictive, but we are in basically the black soils and the gray or the gray wooded soils here in Manitoba. But they say growers who farm in the dark brown, the black, the gray, or the gray wooded soil zones who receive less than 125 millimeters of accumulated rainfall between June 1 and September 1. Those are kind of the magic dates. We always talk about June 1 to August 31st or June 1 to Sep 1. That's where the moisture, basically after herbicide application and during the growing season, that's where our breakdown is taking place. So if you did not get that 125 millimeters of rain, so if you have applied Solo Ultra, or Viper ADV in 2021, you should not plant canola, durum wheat, or canary seed in 2022. Normally that would have been allowed, but that you're asked to wait one more year now. You won't be planting that in 2022. If you applied Odyssey NXT, Odyssey Ultra, or Odyssey Ultra NXT in 2021, you should not plant durum wheat or canary seed in 2022. And if you applied Odyssey NXT, Odyssey Ultra, or Odyssey Ultra in 2020, so that's last year, you should not be planting canola in 2020. So, and then at the very bottom of the document, it talks about, I've just got that and I've just put that here right at the very bottom. Due to the extreme risk of crop injury, BASF will not be supporting canola, durum wheat, and canary seed as follow crops in the 2022 season if these recommendations are not followed. So these are recommendations above and beyond what is on the label already. And, you know, you're going to have to stick to what's on the label because we've seen lots of carryover issues before, you know, certain spots in the field and the overlaps, that type of thing. But the extreme lack of moisture has basically pushed our rotation out further one more year for if you're using any of these chemistries. So moving on to some different group 2s, the sulphonylureas, they're actually broken down very differently. They're broken down by acid hydrolysis, which basically ceases about pH 6.8. And microbial degradation on the SUs is very slow. But some of the SUs have very little carryover in the soil, and some have a lot. I think if we kind of look at one end of the spectrum to the other, if you're looking at your express or your refined, there's very little carryover for those type of SUs. And then at the far end of the spectrum, if you remember Glean, or I think it's called Keller, that had a lot of carryover in the soil and could persist for years. So within the sulphonylureas, there's a lot of different types of, there's a lot of different there's a range, I guess, in how they carry over, and also too, and even some of the SUs too do have to some extent a little bit of microbial degradation in them, but in general, it's mostly by acid hydrolysis. So carryover tends to be higher in high pH soils, which is about 6.8, which is because acid hydrolysis ceases. And acid hydrolysis is minimally affected by soil moisture, organic matter, texture, microbes, soil compaction, aeration, all that type of thing. Hydrolysis will increase as temperature increases and pH decreases below 6.8. So temperature does have a factor in this as well, but again, it's primarily based on pH, which we really have very little control over in our soils. Oh no. Okay, sorry, I'm frozen again. Bear with me. Okay, we'll start again. I really don't know why this is doing this. I'm really sorry. Okay. Okay, so group 2, yet another type of group 2, which is our flucarbazole, which is Everest or Sierra. These are the part of the SACTs. Herbicide, and this is something that we saw an issue with this year already with flucarbazole, and I've actually just cut and pasted this right out of our guide to crop protection. So again, in Manitoba, our black soils, or we're in the gray wooded soils as well. Normally for rotational crops, we're talking about, you know, quite a good variety of rotational crops. What we do see in here, field peas has an asterisk beside it, so I've highlighted that, and it says it may be grown the year after flucarbazole application where precipitation has been equal to or above the 10-year average during the growing season, and where organic matter content is above 4%, and where pH is below 7.5. So unfortunately, in a lot of fields this year where peas were grown, none of these conditions were met, and we did see quite a bit of flucarbazole injury to peas. So you would have to meet all 3 of those conditions in order to grow field peas following an Everest or Sierra, or basically a flucarbazole application. And the company suggests a minimum of 100 millimeters, which is 4 inches of rain, is needed in the 60 days following application for adequate breakthrough to take place. And again, it also says other rotational crops might also be affected if rainfall is less than the 10-year average for the area, which again, we're far below that. Soils in the gray wooded, the black and the dark brown soils with a combination of low organic matter, which is less than 2%. And we did see this on some of our soils that we saw this residue issues on with the flucarbazole. Light textured soils or high pH, which is greater than 7.5. Again, a lot of soils in Manitoba are higher than 7.5, especially at the surface, which is where the residue is affecting our crop growth. So they may result in delayed growth and development in rotational crops. So you just have to be really careful with some of these. And again, this is a picture standing in a pea field. I'm in the Holland area, and I'm actually standing on the top of a knoll where it was actually a little bit thin, and we were seeing a little bit of funny crop growth, but you can see off here in the distance on these eroded knolls, again, where our pH is higher, we've got less organic matter. We've also got some lighter textured soils here at the top. So basically we're 0 for 3 on the conditions that we need in order for the residue to not be affecting our crop. And then this is what some of these field peas in that area look like. We can see that they're very yellowed. We've got yellowed growing points. We've got some kind of bizarre growth, and we actually saw a lot of these peas trying to regrow and sending up multiple shoots. I think I dug up one plant that had as much as 12 new shoots coming up from that pea seed. These are very resilient plants. They're really trying, but they just couldn't, the residue just affected them, and it affected them all year. And they ended up in a lot of these fields, those areas stayed green all year, and ended up like at harvest time, they had to be desiccated. They just were, never got much past this stage. Most of them had no pods on them at all, and they stayed really green, just trying to grow that residue all year. So again, that was a big issue this year, and it's going to be a big issue again next year, so really watch that one. So group 3, which is our DNA herbicides, these are our old ones that we've had around for a long time. Edge and Treflan, these ones photodegrade rapidly, so they must be incorporated. So they will degrade very nicely on their own if you don't incorporate them. Why it's so important. They're broken down mostly by microbial breakdown. So again, we could see carryover increased in dry soils. So that's something that we may want to watch. We may want to watch your cereal crops following some group 3 application. Okay, so moving on, group 4 clopyralid, again, mostly microbial breakdown. Legumes in particular are really sensitive to carryover. Normally you wait 22 months. Recropping on the label, basically your cereals, your flax, forage grasses, mushroom, canola, but they also have a statement in here that you need to have greater than 140 millimeters, or which is 5.5 inches from June 1 to August 31st, and greater than 175 millimeters, almost 7 inches over the entire growing season. So if you do meet those conditions, you actually can grow soybeans a year after, but we obviously haven't met those conditions. And so you'd have to be really careful with any of your legume crops, which is your peas and your soybeans. And that's any herbicide containing clopyralid. Now the residues here are also water soluble. So we do see some residue issues as well, where that residue washes out from manure, from animals that have been fed treated crop, or from just plant residue in general. So that's something to watch with clopyralid, not so much the other ones, but clopyralid for sure. Triazines in Western Manitoba, this is our atrazine for our corn crops. Degradation is similar to sulphonylureas, so it's not really affected by microbial as much. They do tend to be more active in high pH soils, so they do break down a little bit better, but also too, they can get broken down by photodegradation if it remains on the soil surface. So again, the more it breaks down, the less there is to carry over, but then the flip side of that is there's less active to go after the weeds as well. So, oh sorry, this picture's out of place. That was actually a group 4 residue. That is clopyralid residue on some soybeans, and you see that it's typical group 4 injury, lots of cupping and curling. They'll actually form just little cups there that will actually hold water. It's pretty typical. A little harder to tell apart the different group 4, whether it's drift or carryover from some of the other group 4s, but again, they all have that similar growth pattern when there's either been a residue or a drift issue on group 4s. For group 14, talking about authority mainly, but there's different subgroups in group 14. Some of them are contact foliar, some of them are soil active, like in authority, some of them are a little bit of both. In particular, those sulfentrazone is what we're more concerned about. We're concerned about the ones that are soil active because, you know, we're relying on the residual activity of them. And especially we see this with some of our emerging weed issues like our pigweeds and things like that. So they're degraded by soil microbes. So again, anything that slows down those soil microbes, which is the extreme lack of moisture, that's going to affect degradation. Solubility with authority, it increases, or with sulfentrazone, it increases with your pH above 7.8 when your organic matter is greater than 6%, in fine textured soils with less than 1.5% organic matter, and also in coarse textured soils. So when solubilities increase, that also increases your risk of crop injury. So we you know, when it shouldn't be applied to those soils, and in soils that are approaching those parameters, we may see more risk of injury to subsequent crops. And it's actually on the label to apply only once every 2 years. So these, we can use authority ahead of a number of crops now, and I think we just need to be careful that we're using it very carefully and using it where we need to use it for the weed spectrum that we've got. Because we can't be overusing it, and we only should be using it once every 2 years anyways. So group 27, these are newer chemistries for us. They're Armazon, Infinity, Shieldex, Lotus. So these are, these guys, there can be some carryover issues with these, and they're newer to us. And again, we did see some Armazon injury in some overlap areas on the fields from Armazon that was applied in 2020, and we saw that this year. On the Infinity label, this is just something that I just pulled out of the book. The recropping, and they don't have anything for Manitoba. They're basically talking most crops: alfalfa, barley, canary seed, canola, field corn, Manitoba only. Flax, potatoes, soybeans, again, Manitoba only, can be grown after Armazon, sunflowers, tamotes, and wheat. So it's got quite a broad label now, and it says field peas may be grown the following season in black and gray wooded and dark brown soil zones. And again, in the brown soil zones, which we don't have, but again, we see there, this is where they start to talk about high pH, low organic matter. And that's where, again, we're going to see some of these issues with carryover in a dry year, even though normally we wouldn't see this, but with these group 27s, because they're broken down by microbial factors, those low pHs, those high pHs, and the low soil organic matter, you can expect to see maybe some issues. And when you're looking for carryover, I find you see a lot of this bleaching. These are kind of bleaching, they're bleaching herbicides anyways, but you see this edge of this, you'll really see a nice white or yellowy white edge to some of these, some of the susceptible crops. That'll fade, so it's a bit transient. So, but you do see that, you will see that it's quite distinct. So I've seen that with some group 27 carryover. So checking for residues, there's 3 different things you can do. You can do chemical analysis. I would not recommend this. When I worked as an agronomist, some of my farmers wanted to do this. Cost a few $100. You get some numbers back, and I honestly had no idea what they meant. Can I grow crops safely with that amount of that many parts per million or parts per billion in the soil of whatever herbicide we were looking at? I don't know. So really, I really did not encourage anyone to do this. Some people wanted to do it anyways, but I don't know what to do with the numbers, and I don't think anybody really does. So after that, though, you could do a plant bioassay or a field bioassay. With a plant bioassay, basically you're gathering some soil. You need to get representative samples of soil from different areas because of the different pH effects, because of the different organic matter in the different areas in the fields. So you'd want to make sure that you've got those and, have them labeled, and you've got different types of soil from different areas in the field to see how your susceptible crops are going to grow. This is something, though, that you could do over the winter. Now, you can do this yourself. Again, you're just gathering up some soil. You just want to get that top couple of inches because that's where the residue is, and that's where it's going to affect crop growth at the beginning of the year. And anyways, so that would be something that you could do yourself, or you could actually get it done as well. You could get that done because somebody, may have just better growing, be able to grow those pots better than you can, but that's something you could do. You can also do a field bioassay, but you need to have large enough areas to represent the field. So again, those different areas in the field, you would normally do this in strips, and you would hopefully have an area that a check strip, compare it to where you could see what no residue would look like. Now, this is all obviously done in season. So again, you're going to be taking that field or part of that field anyways out of production while you're doing this field bioassay. But a lot of herbicide labels will recommend a field bioassay for sensitive crops, or if we don't know. So again, just moving on, water use by weeds. One of the reasons that I really would like to see the weeds gone this fall, I'm not really a fan right now of waiting for winter to come and kill them, or waiting for a good frost to come and kill them, because we haven't had that yet. They're strong competitors for water and for nutrients, and this is something that John and Marla could maybe talk more about the nutrients. Some studies show that weeds use 2 to 3 times the water as the crop does during the season, and that's like in some corn crops, some of the annual broadleaf weeds compared to the corn crop. The broadleaf weeds were using quite a bit more water, and that's in crop. I don't know in the fall whether or not that holds true. I'm not sure. And when I'm talking weeds here, I'm also talking our volunteer crops that are regrowing, because a weed is a crop that's anything that's grown in an area where it's not a plant that's growing where it's not wanted. So right now, our volunteer crops that are regrowing, those are weeds. Tillage to destroy the weeds, I'm not a fan of that, especially this fall. It will dry the soil out further. And then, of course, there's some salinity issues when we're looking at some of our weeds, our fox barley, our kochia, some of our saline loving weeds. And again, that's something that Marla could talk to about salinity issues in tillage. And just to finish up, this is actually from Les Henry's latest article, Drought I Have Known. And he said subsoil moisture, these are a couple of quotes from his article that was just in the paper recently. And it says subsoil moisture will still be there until a plant root comes looking for it. Weeds are still growing, so obviously that moisture is being taken up by our weeds. And he also made the comment that crops are done using water for this year. The harvested crop, yes. but they're regrowing now along with the weeds. So we are still using water. I am concerned about the amount of water use. We don't know what's coming at us in the winter for precipitation as snow or as even some late fall rains. We don't know what's coming at us in the spring. And I'm concerned, about these weeds using up a lot of water because there's a lot of biomass out there in some of these fields when it comes to weeds. So with that, I will stop sharing. Thank you for putting up with my technical issues. And I guess if there's questions, we can take them now.
We're used to dealing with technical issues. It's all good. All good, Kim. And thank you for getting through it, because I know that sometimes your computer doesn't care for doing this type of thing. So you'd think that maybe it's a Monday problem, but it's just your computer problem, right?
It's just my computer, yes.
Exactly, it's just your computer. That's okay. My computer likes to glitch out on me as well. We need new computer. I'm just gonna, that's what we need. So comments that have been coming in and questions and such while you've been presenting. Comment that came in about pH. So seeing soils that are as low as 4.2 pH here. And I know that that's one of the things that John has talked about too, with regards to certain nutrient deficiencies or problems that we've been seeing in some of our kind of highly nitrogen fertilized over many, many years, sandier soils where some of our pHs are dropping. And so considering that, are there any additional comments that you have to make regarding how we need to start thinking about herbicide rotations, essentially crop rotations, but then those herbicide rotations where we are seeing those soil pHs drop?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the biggest issue with that is just physically crop growth at low pHs is affected, and your crops are generally under a little bit more stress, because once you get into those really low pHs, your root system, the plant is under stress. So then it makes any of the other stresses that much worse. Yeah, but like I said, it's that is something that in some of these fields we certainly have to look at. Normally, again, it's going to depend on the herbicide, and that's something that you'll have to sit down with an agronomist. And again, I think some of these herbicide or some of these low pHs are occurring in, like you said, some of the lighter soils, maybe some of our soils that have been heavily irrigated over the years, that type of thing. So some of those are in a pretty tight rotation, like if they've got potatoes in the rotation, that type of thing. But yeah, there is some data out there on different pHs and different herbicides. But generally, I think the biggest factor is just crop growth at those pHs. Is negatively affected in general, and then that makes all of the other stresses that much worse.
And while we're on the topic of pH, I want to pull Curtis into this conversation too, because yesterday Curtis was talking about soil erosion and landscape restoration. And when we're dealing with some of these eroded knolls and things, there is kind of usually the opposite problem if we're exposing subsoil that has high pH on some of those eroded knolls. Then how does that end up kind of playing into some of our planning and understanding of how herbicide carryover might be affecting regionally within the field?
Yeah, that's some of the stuff we were looking at, and some of it I'm still trying to find. I know I've seen some of it in our analysis here, but yeah, generally eroded soils with that subsoil exposed, most of our soils, especially on hilltops where you haven't had a lot of infiltration and leaching of carbonates, they're going to have exposed carbonates right to the surface. So generally are going to be high pHs above 7, maybe even getting close to 8 in some extreme cases, depending on your parent material. And then it's the other extreme can be there too. Some of the soils that have had a lot of leaching that are well drained and maybe didn't have a lot of carbonates to start with. One of the examples I think is back home, some of the Manitou soils. I think they have a surface pH, I'm not positive, but I think it's I've seen 4.8 or 5, somewhere in that range. So we used to, when I started as with Manitoba Agriculture back in 19, they said that there's only high pH soils in Manitoba. There's no acid soils or low pH soils, and we know that that's not some truly acid soils up around Dauphin, and then you also have some well-drained or well-leached soils that could be very productive, and they're lower pH than you think. So if you're not sure, take a soil test.
Mm-hmm. And I think in particular, that's really good, Curtis. In particular, it's just the IMIs would be the ones that we'd be most concerned about, the group 2, the IMIs, because those ones are much more, cause a lot more problems at the lower pHs. So those ones you would have to be really careful with. You'd really have to be watching those ones.
I muted myself earlier. So then the other comment that kind of follows this then was saying that, you know, they've been seeing people, or they have been liming for years, but there's a lot of people who haven't been. And so when you are dealing with those acid soils or more acidic soils, surface soils, liming may be able to adjust that pH. Depending on a lot of different factors, obviously, and how much buffering capacity your soil has to resist liming and such, it will obviously affect that decision or how much lime needs to be applied. And also, liming is not a one-time fix, right? Because your soil pH can potentially continue changing because those same factors are being applied on it. But it is, does anybody have comments on liming as well? No one wants to touch it.
I was going to say, what do you think, Marla? But
exactly. Well,
the only ones I know of are the potato guys. Some potato soils, because they're sandy and because they're highly leached and they're irrigated, can come back with low pH. And then I think historically the economics work better for soils like that to even consider liming. But feel free to add or contest that.
Well, I mean, if you're liming can have a benefit. Again, you have to till that lime in order to get that benefit as well, right? Mixing that lime material into that topsoil to get that change to happen. So, you know, surface spreading lime without having that tillage isn't going to do a whole lot. So there are or it can, but very, very slowly, and it's not going to affect into the soil. It's just going to affect the surface. But we do have that ability to adjust that pH with liming. Since we're on the topic, though, quickly on adjusting pH, in case anybody wants to think about the other way when we're dealing with high pH soils, always have to put the reminder out there that while pH can be adjusted in certain directions in Manitoba, like say liming in a more acidic soil, the idea of decreasing pH or lowering pH using something like elemental sulfur is not going to work in our Manitoba soils because of the high free lime content that we have. So when you're talking about moving around pH, shifting things, that kind of thing, you always want to look at certain factors on your soil test. So your buffer pH is going to be an important thing to look at. And then the other one is if you are dealing with high pH soils, looking at your calcium carbonate equivalent. And our soils in Manitoba have a very high, generally calcium carbonate equivalent. And so if you are trying to lower soil pH by adding elemental sulfur to get rid of some of those high pH issues that you feel that you want to get rid of, all you're going to do is cause a salinity problem and put a lot of money into putting down elemental that's not really going to do a whole heck of a lot. So something to kind of generally keep in mind. Hey, John, you're back. You're already unmuted.
I am back. I apologize for skipping out. I brought my computer to the office, and hopefully Kim and I can get beyond our technical difficulties here. Anyways, good stuff on the liming. You know, it is something that generally before we didn't do much liming, but that's one thing that variable rate or field assessment through zones, whatever, has helped identify for us that there are some areas that are low in pH. And I think that stateside, it's often low pH and herbicide residue that kicks the stuffing out of crops with Pursuit and Odyssey carryover and really shows the benefit to liming in those cases. One other thing, we shouldn't be blaming poor crops on herbicide residues just because the pH is low. Like that's that's an excuse for not dealing with the pH issue. And so we really should be looking at that, because in the past year in Manitoba, we've seen herbicide group 2 simulated injuries in canola, but it's due to manganese and aluminum toxicity that occurs in low pH soil. So you may think the herbicide companies are in for soft touch and going to pay you out on something like that. But if they do their due diligence and figure out, it'll be a pH problem more than a herbicide residue issue.
So do you have an additional comment there, Kim, before we move into another question?
No, it's okay. No, that, like I said, I kind of covered that too. I think a lot of the pH issues are, again, at a low pH, you've got lots of other things going on. It's not necessarily a herbicide. The group 2s, the IMIs, are definitely going to be the worst affected or the most affected by that, but there's a lot of other things too, so it's not a simple diagnosis. Herbicide residue is complex at the best of times, and when you start adding in a lot of other things like our good old soil fertility, we know it's never black and white. So it's lots of times a combination. And again, I saw a bit of that manganese toxicity when I worked in Saskatchewan and kind of north of Yorkton there, and we were seeing a little bit of that. And it was, you know, there was always the thinking, oh, it was herbicide residue, but it ended up being a pH issue. So a little bit of both, but more so the pH and the nutritional status of the crop versus the actual herbicide issues.
Yeah. And your viewers, Marla, in Saskatchewan and Alberta, will be probably much more tuned into these low pH issues than we are in Manitoba.
Yeah, and so just, I guess, when we're talking about things like thinking back to what we talked about with the eroded knolls and everything yesterday with Curtis, I think it's just kind of puts it out there even more so. There are so many complicated things that are happening on those eroded knolls where crop growth is affected by multiple different kind of factors that are all related back to the fact that it's dry and there's not a lot of topsoil. The pH is high. John may touch a little bit on nutrient issues and seed place fertilizer toxicity, essentially, that we end up seeing on those knolls. All this to kind of drive home the importance of thinking about managing those knolls and actually considering the idea of landscape restoration, because that can kind of fix a lot of these different problems. Because again, it is complicated and there's a lot of things that are causing that crop loss up on those eroded knolls, and fix it. Okay. So this is an interesting conversation though when we talk about the idea of tillage and whether we want to be tilling in these dry times. A comment came in. Does anyone want to comment on tillage as a potential way of diluting the dose of carryover herbicide? The comment is, I'm just putting it out there, don't expect anyone to hug me for bringing it up, but can tillage actually dilute that carryover herbicide effect?
Yes, yeah,
okay.
yes, it can. I've actually seen references where moldboard plowing, which is like a flipping of the soil, right? Now, this is, again, you guys are just trying to get soil and water credits on this talk and you're not getting them.
You're getting half of them, I think.
Crop management, this is a crop management credit. But the moldboard plowing, I've seen several references to that where like a deep soil tillage and that diluting, because when we're talking about doing a field bioassay, you're taking the top 2 to 3 inches. And I've done this myself. I've gone out and got some flucarbazone treated soils for next year's diagnostic school, and maybe to do some field bioassays during the winter if I've gotten enough of it. If anybody out there has some soil that they'd like me to try to do some of this with, just contact me after, because I think we should maybe take a look at this and see what we can do. But again, you're only dealing with the top couple of inches. I mean, that's the instructions, is just take the top couple of inches, because that's where the residue is and that's where the problem is. So any dilution anything will dilute. And again, something like a moldboard plowing, which is a deep inversion, can really help. But some of our soils are quite thin and we don't really want to be doing a lot of that, I think, at the best of times.
Yeah, being the old guy on the panel here and being a refugee from Ontario, I'm very aware of in the olden days, that used to be one of the Hail Marys when it came to dealing with atrazine residues. And we had a very good lab at the University of Guelph that would do atrazine residues. And again, like Kim said, it would leave you with a number and then you were stuck trying to deal with that. One of the Hail Mary passes was to talk about diluting that. But you know, people were never really happy because even if you tried something like that, you would still have those eroded knolls, those high pH areas showing up with injury. So yeah, and I don't expect anyone on the prairies people on the prairies, you don't know how to use a moldboard plow anyways. That's why you don't have them. So that isn't an option.
I have to tell, I was once at a tillage day in Minnesota with Jody DeYoung-Hughes, who was putting it on, and there's all sorts of equipment that was being run, and we were looking at how it affected the soil, and so taking soil pits after the fact, looking at how soil mixing was happening behind the equipment. And the John Deere dealers came out with a moldboard plow, and none of them had ever run it before. And so they were all in an absolute panic over getting it done right the first time. So they went off into some corner of another farmer's field where they could actually try to set it, because again, none of them had used it. And so it's not as common a piece of equipment that ends up getting used in a lot of places these days, which is a good thing, but there are maybe places for it. However, when we're talking about dry years like this and we're trying to decrease the impact of tillage or the potential for tillage, then we might not be so keen on having that discussion. So thanks for bringing that topic up to our question asker. But I think it's an important thing to bring forward, that there is that possibility, but then you are weighing the benefits and side effects when it comes to that type of tillage. And that's really what we're here to talk about this week. Is all of this is complicated. How to deal with your weeds and volunteers that are coming up, that, you know, you might have weeds and volunteers that are coming up that are Roundup resistant or can't be managed as easily by spraying. And so tillage might be a way to deal with it, but you know, how do we weigh the benefits and risks then of tilling a crop or a volunteer up and maybe losing some moisture through the active tillage versus having let that volunteer grow and losing potentially more moisture through the growth and transpiration of that plant?
Yeah, maybe I should mention something else here that I've seen showing up in the news or hearing about Manitoba, about some of our stressed corn has dropped corn cobs, and that it's due because I think they're saying that the stress during pollination, whatever, just reallocation of resources, the shanks on the corn are weak. And previous weed specialist Tammy Jones was showing me we're quite a bit of drop in some stressed fields. So one of those things, those corn cobs become great weed piles next year. Best way to manage is to leave them on top. Some people think I should bury weed seeds. That's like putting them in a dormancy and seeding them. And sometimes the best place to leave stuff is on the surface, so it can well, face Mother Nature, wildlife or whatever, and probably easier to control than if we put it in the soil.
So the comment came in that Tammy commented, "Don't worry, John, the cows will get those drop cobs." So,
that's the wildlife I was talking about.
Yeah, exactly, the wildlife. So coming back to this idea of the season that we're in right now and the conditions that we're dealing with, because we've had warmer conditions as well as these kind of dry conditions, a question has come in: are sulphonylureas breaking down more quickly this fall because of above average temperatures?
That I don't know. I don't know, because normally when we talk about, like, because that is the chemical hydrolysis, I wouldn't be able to comment on that, because normally we're talking about breakdown during the growing, like that you know, that during that time period, June 1 to Sep 1 kind of thing. That's where microbial breakdown takes place. Your chemical hydrolysis can still be taking place. It's definitely mediated by temperature and pH. So yeah, high temperatures in theory then would be in, as long as the pH is in the right range, then your high temperatures should be in contributing to its breaking down more.
But it would also need water, right? For
At some point,
hydro-
for hydrolysis, you have to have water. Yeah, yeah, you still have to have some water.
The dry conditions, I think, when we're talking about chemical reactions or microbial reactions with the dry conditions, it does slow everything down, even though we're dealing with hotter conditions. So it might not be happening as fast or faster.
And speaking of the hot conditions, I've been hearing a few people not super happy with how quickly their weed control is working this fall. It is working eventually, but it seems to be taking a little bit longer than they thought. Whether it's just, we've got rapid growth on the weeds, like there isn't much moisture, but they are accessing it. These hot temperatures and stuff, I'm not sure, but I have been hearing but in most cases, it is still working. It just does seem to be taking a little bit longer than they thought to start to see the herbicides working, but they are working. But that is something. Our SUs generally work better when it's warm. Those are really maybe not something to leave right till the very end. But again, looking forward at the forecast, we've still got till next week. Our temperatures are still pretty good. We still haven't had a killing frost anywhere that I know of. Maybe a touch of frost here and there, but we've still got a lot of weed growth can occur in the next few weeks as well. So.
Yeah, you weed specialists always talk about hot, dry weather. That's when you get these waxy layers on things. So I'd expect that we just turn the page back 3 months to when it's really hot and dry in June. And I have to tell people, if you're expecting your herbicides to work, you need to either spice them up or be patient. And like I'm looking out there, it's still a drought and it's still hot. These weeds are using moisture. I couldn't get on the line earlier, but my little calculations based on those charts you showed yesterday, Marla, says using, let's see, a 20th to 2/10 of an inch of water a day in some cases. And so it's just drying out the soil, but they're growing under tough conditions, and I'm sure they're just hardened off.
Yeah, we were 32 degrees yesterday in places. So how different is that than, like you said, than what we faced in June and July? It's not. It really isn't. So I'm a fan of surfactants. Use as much surfactant as you can, as whatever's on the label, especially depending which glyphosate product you're using. If you're using maybe one of the not the Bayer brands, then I would be wanting to I would not be afraid to be putting some extra surfactant in there just to make sure that it's working, because we know the surfactant quality in the Bayer brands is really good in the real Roundup type thing, but surfactants is huge this fall. I think that's something that it would not hurt at all to be throwing in some extra surfactant.
Okay, and
it's a little bit more common.
Yeah, a question came in too on this topic of the hot weather that we're having right now, and in terms of recropping restrictions. So is there any comment on effective rainfall for herbicide degradation when we had 30+ temperatures and very windy conditions for a week after a rainfall? Our area has had enough rain to avoid most recropping restrictions, but we're still concerned about seeding sensitive crops on some fields.
Yeah, and I think you guys talked earlier too about some of these rains coming and they really weren't that effective at soaking in, and the moisture was lost kind of before it was used. And I would be concerned on that as well, because I think we did lose a lot of the moisture before it was, I would be concerned. I am concerned on that, because like you said, the high winds, we had a lot of transpiration, evapotranspiration, especially on some of our soils that are really bare. We didn't have a lot of crop growth covering the ground yet. We didn't, even on our narrow crop canola and wheat, took a long time to fill in those rows. So we had a lot more moisture losses from the precipitation events we were getting. So I would be concerned on that, that there might be some sensitivities, even though technically the rain or the right amount of precipitation came.
And we may have you may have touched on this a little bit earlier, but like how long can we let those weeds steal nutrients and water from this fall? So if we're dealing with things and we're trying to make decisions on how to control them, how long do we think that we can let things go before we have to make a really quick decision? Do we wait?
From a water, I think it's They need to go. That's my personal opinion. I think they need to go. I'm really concerned. But I also grew up in the Southwest and I remember the 80s. I remember the dry years. So again, maybe that clouds my judgment, but I think they need to go, or they should have gone already. And I think we are starting to see a lot of people now, just now thinking about spraying because they were waiting for a frost. I mean, we're into October. We haven't had that frost yet. Our normal frosts are usually mid-September. Our long-term average killing frost is September 12th to 14th, or somewhere in there for most of the province. And I'm, to me, I think they should be gone already because I'm concerned we may not get that frost until freeze up, and our soils may not necessarily freeze until November 10th is our deadline for applying fertilizer, right? So basically we could have another month of this if we don't get a killing frost until then, and that could be, if you do the math on the moisture. And then John can probably speak to the nutrients.
Well, I'll just mention a bit of good news. Good news for me, Marla. Anyways, I was out to a farm just 2 days ago looking at this expensive cover crop that had been seeded. And the good news on the cover crop is that there was a little bit of moisture early, enough to germinate the seeds. And that's been so dry since all those seeds died. And so the good news is that the cover crop, it isn't going to compete for moisture. It isn't going to compete for nutrients. The thing is dead. And all the farmer is out is, $34 an acre of some expensive cover crop seed. I was concerned that some of these cover crops were going to be robbers or pirates for nutrients and water, but it's been so dry that most of them failed anyways. Mm-hmm. So in my books, that's some good news.
Yeah.
What about for nutrients in there? When do we get them back? Like when those weeds die?
Yeah. We used to talk about weeds and volunteer crop regrowth, that in wet environments, it's a good thing. It takes up nitrogen and nutrients that otherwise might be lost. We aren't in Maryland or Ohio or Ontario. Our soils freeze up over winter and we don't have the same losses. We do have some wet years, but this ain't one of them. And so this is a rather inappropriate time to have or require that. There's a mounting body of evidence out of the Midwest and North Dakota, and we've heard from places closer than that where, well, actually, University Farm in Carmen did work on this, where nitrogen taken up by cover crops or volunteer crops in the fall are not all returned to the following crop. They're taken up into an organic fraction, and they are not permanently lost, but they're not metered out to coincide with crop uptake next year. In some cases, more nitrogen is required than if the crop had been, if the volunteer had been controlled. So that's an extra kick in the pants. Not only might yields be encumbered somewhat because you've dried out the soil, but that nitrogen that they've taken up are not available. So I think I mentioned the other day, having a cover crop of these things, it's like asking your brother-in-law to move in with you. If things could go really bad.
Yeah, and we talk about that a lot, because when people are talking about growing or using crops or letting the volunteers grow as a cover crop, that type of thing, they're talking about using something to build soil by having a living root, having cover, having all of that there for kind of soil health reasons. In the long term, having something like that built into a cropping system may be beneficial. It's the short-term decisions that become the problem, right? Using it in the dry years where it could potentially rob soil moisture that is very precious to us right now. That's a time when we are a bit more concerned about now being the time to adopt it. And so, yes, it can help to build soil resilience. It can help to build soil structure potentially and do all of those things if you're using it in combination with, say, no-till, and then using that for weed control to choke out other weeds, that type of thing. But it's long-term decisions. In the short term, there can be ups and downs in terms of how those activities can affect us. And when we're talking about, this week and what we're talking about with dry conditions, none of the things that we're talking about this week are really we talk about a lot of long-term decisions, but we're trying to do short-term fixes, but none of these things are going to fix a bad situation. We're just trying to limp through a bad situation, and how can we decrease that overall effect or mitigate some of the negatives that might be kind of haunting us next year as we come through this very dry year and a very dry fall. And so that's, I think, an important point. We're trying to help to think through, you know, how we can struggle through the current, but also thinking about long-term tillage decisions, long-term crop management decisions. Some of those things could help, but it's down the road if we're dealing with these types of things again. None of these things are going to help us in the immediate short term.
Something I just wanted to mention, I don't like it that you know, some of these residual herbicides are getting a bad rap, because right now, you know, Kim and we all know that with herbicide resistant weeds on the horizon, you know, they need to be a part of our system. And it's too bad that some of these residues are continuing on, but let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. These are required strategies for us, and we can't go back to just using glyphosate alone and repeated treatments like we've seen in corn and soybeans here. We need some of these other products there, and so it's just one of the challenges or strategies we need to continue with.
Absolutely.
And when we're dealing with herbicide resistant weeds, if you just look south of the border where they're dealing with corn soybean rotations, and they're dealing with some things like the pigweeds, like the palmer and the water hemp, you know, they're talking about a much more expensive herbicide program than what we have here. And a big part of that is a pre-herbicide. It just has to be part of the equation, because you're not going to be able to grow crops after that.
Yeah.
So without that, and it's just going at being able to get on the farm when you can, cover that ground several times during the year. So our herbicide programs, I think, are going to do nothing but get more expensive in order to keep growing some of these crops, and that's just the way it is.
Way to bring us back to the crop management credits for the final push at the end of this. So, but it's an important thing. Yeah.
I just wanted to say I'm all for covering the ground and cover crops and all that type of thing. I think that that is great, like to cover that ground and stop evaporative losses off the soil, but there's no reason why you can't do it with dead weeds. You can still cover that ground with dead weeds. They'll trap some snow, and I just would rather, I'm okay with that. That's what I'd rather see.
Well, I think it's good we're wrapping up on that this discussion of the idea of long-term management, whether it's soil management and cropping systems management, and long-term decisions to benefit us in the future, especially if we're dealing with the potential for a lot of these resistant weeds being a problem in the future. So with that, because we have hit our hour, I'd like to thank our panelists again today. Join us tomorrow again, and thank you to all of our attendees as well for asking your questions. Join us tomorrow. John Hurd is going to be taking us into post-drought nutrient management decision-making topic. And so we will be back tomorrow morning at 8:30, and I hope everybody has a great day.
Thanks.
Bye.
Very good. Bye.
Bye.